Hi there, welcome to Critical Issues in American History. My name is David Goundry and this is my final assignment. I've chosen Religion's Impact on American History, a Journey Through Time. In this presentation we'll explore how religious beliefs, their various movements and their accompanying practices have played a vital role in shaping America's historical, political, social and cultural landscape. The America we see today was not established overnight. And it is my belief that as we journey through America's history through the lens of religion, we will understand what has shaped the America of today. At the very beginning here in the begin stages of American history in colonial America, the 1550s to the 1780s, we have the Puritans and we have the Pilgrims. Motivations for leaving Europe were basically based around religious persecution. They left Europe and sought more freedom in their religion. The Pilgrims, they were separatists who sought religious freedom. They arrived on the Mayflower in 1620 and they quickly established the Plymouth colony. The Puritans, they sought to quote-unquote purify the Church of England and they founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. And then they established a theocratic government. So here we have the very genesis and early stages of Christianity taking root in a land that was primarily used to nature and religion of the ground and of the air, through the Native Americans being the predominant faith, if you will. The impact is that they laid the foundation for religious-based governance, and they influenced early American values and the work ethic that they had. Quickly after them, still within the times of colonial America, we had the Quakers. These Quakers, again, they established theocratic elements in some of the colonies. They had a fusion of church and state in places like Massachusetts as well. And they also had religious tests for office and restrictions on non-Puritan beliefs. So the Quakers and the Puritans, and in this time period, they brought all of these things together where religion started to affect for the first time offices in which people would serve within the early government. They had beliefs of the inner light of God was found within every single person. Pacifism and equality was a strong belief of theirs. They had key figures like William Penn, who founded the Pennsylvania Holy Experiment, and then they also promoted religious tolerance. I was quite familiar with a lot of the Quakers. My hometown in England, a place called Darlington, our soccer team is even named after the Quakers, and we had quite a large population of them going back throughout the years, and their impact there was still strong. And when they brought that over to America, you can still see plenty of that impact, especially in the early days, but you can still find some of it today. But their initial impact was that they advanced concepts of religious freedom and influenced abolitionists and the women's rights movements as well. Then as time moved forward, we had the first Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s. We had a couple of key figures in Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. They had a focus on personal salvation and emotional worship, and it challenged traditional church authority at the time. Jonathan Edwards, a congregational preacher, is most well known for his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he was one of them that emphasized personal religious experience. George Whitefield, who was ministering around the same time, was an Anglican preacher, and he traveled the country extensively, preaching to large crowds. And this was the beginning of popularizing a revival style preaching, of which we see continuing to grow over the centuries. The first Great Awakening that we had with primarily these two guys and many others did have an impact on society. The democratization of religion, contributing to a spirit of independence and individual rights, started to permeate society. It challenged traditional religious authority. It promoted individual interpretation of scripture. increased literacy. It encouraged the formation of new colleges, places like Princeton, which is still a very well-renowned and respected college today. It also had cross-colonial unification that started to foster a sense of a shared American identity. This was something that was not really there before when it came to religion. And then it contributed to the democratic ideals and individualism. Moving forward, though, a few years later, when we had the Second Great Awakening of 1790 to 1840s, as we continue our journey, the First Amendment was one of the key changes in society at this time. The influence of the Enlightenment ideals and the need to unify diverse religious groups led to this First Amendment. And one of the sources that we were looking at in our earlier studies in the course talked about the wall of separation concept with Jefferson, talked about how this letter emphasized that the government should not interfere with religious practices or vice versa, but ensured that religion remained a private matter free from government influence. And here you can see there is a First Amendment quote that says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." This diversity was more denominational, as that we started to get more diversity and differences. And one of the sources that we read quoted this: "Only with hindsight does the Great Awakening look more like a unified movement." The first revivals began unexpectedly in the congregational churches in New England in the 1730s and then spread throughout the 1740s and 50s to Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists in the rest of the other 13 colonies. Even within the different expressions of Christianity, these communities all saw the need to return to a more pious lifestyle. And this was something that was permeating the culture at the time. And this permeation and this sense of a pious culture, along with this separation of church and state, Jefferson's concept of the wall, this metaphoric wall, and the First Amendment, the impact of that is that it prevented a national church, but it also promoted religious pluralism, and then it allowed for the growth of diverse religious movements. So there was a lot of things going on in this melting pot of religion at this particular time. And this is a very critical moment in America's history and the role that religion was going to play, because with everything that was going on, all of the different diverse religious groups and movements, there needed to be something that kind of honed everything together and brought it together. And this Second Great Awakening did help that. But you can see that this is a critical part and time in the American history, and religion has obviously played a key part in that. A part of that, we have some key figures and organizations that were really there helping to establish the church and the movement of Christianity within American society. Men here pictured like Charles Finney, who was a Presbyterian minister, introduced new revival techniques. He emphasized free will and social reform, and at the same time as that you have these individuals that were preaching and doing these things, we also had key organizations, ABS, the American Bible Society, which is still going strong today, still distributing Bibles nationwide, was established. And then also the American Temperance Society. There was one in the UK, and there was one here now in America, which promoted an abstinence from alcohol, again coming out of the Puritan and the Quaker mindset as well, moving towards more of a pious lifestyle, moving away from the things that could tempt people to sin and to do these things, to live a more pure lifestyle. The American Temperance Society was formed in 1826. And its impact, it fueled social reform, its movements, abolitionism, temperance, and women's rights. So we're starting to see these impacts on social reform take a little bit more grip in society at this moment in time and pick up speed a little bit. It also increased church membership and a sense of religious fervour. But then we had religion and the Civil War. Civil War basically tore the country apart, as civil war often does. within the Civil War, really one of the biggest issues was the issue of slavery. And we had religious arguments for and against slavery, both from the church. So here we see religion playing a part where you had some that were pro and some that were anti. There were some that were using biblical justifications to say that slavery was okay. But then there was others that were coming along and saying, no, this is not correct. We have moral and ethical disagreements and arguments with this. So the southern churches had a defense of slavery as a biblical institution, but the northern churches had a moral and ethical opposition to this particular issue. But as the Civil War started to come to an end, you could start to see that there was an emergence of African American and religious faith coming together, and we start to see the establishment of African American churches popping up across America. We had the growth of the independent black churches. So the African Methodist Episcopalian Church was one of the major keystones. There's a picture here to the left of the early church there in 1816, and then also we had the National Baptist Convention in 1880, which obviously happened much later. What was its role during slavery? Well, it provided a community and a support system for all of those that had been affected by it, and also, and this is quite important, it preserved African cultural traditions. Those traditions and those cultures could have quite easily have been lost. All those that they brought in from Africa that were part of who they were and their roots throughout the Civil War could have been taken away and been wiped out. But these new churches were able to be built in such a way that they preserved African culture, and obviously this is vitally important. The spread of black churches also fostered a sense of community and that resistance against segregation. And one of the sources that we read on religion and reform in the course this week, it says this: the revivalist doctrines of salvation, perfectionism, and disinterested benevolence led many evangelical reformers to believe that slavery was the most God-defying of all sins and the most terrible blight on the moral virtue of the United States. Change was about to happen. Things were going to change. America was going to change. And this issue of slavery and how the church responded to this issue was going to augment a lot of that change. Its impact it was the basis for the civil rights activism, centers of education and social services that fostered leadership, and community organizations were also popping up, and it shaped a distinct African American religious traditions that we still see to this day. But as all of this social reform was going on, there was a social gospel emphasis that was starting to happen in the late 19th century and going into the 20th century. A definition of the social gospel is a Christian faith applied to social problems. Here I've got a picture of Walter Reichenbach. He was one of the key figures at this time, and he spearheaded the influence on labor reforms. Again, when the gospel is preached, equality also comes with that, and labor reforms needed to happen in so many different ways. And he was one of the key factors and one of the key players in this movement towards having a social gospel emphasis. This focus areas here you can see is the emphasis was on applying Christian ethics to social issues like poverty, inequality, and labor conditions. So this wasn't applying social ethics or things that felt right to the culture or cultural ethics. This was much higher than that. This was looking at the scriptures, looking at doctrines, and then applying those Christian doctrines, those Christian ethics to these issues of poverty, inequality, and labor conditions. So here, once again, we see how religion is stepping into culture, and it is making its mark as it is attempting to change the culture towards a God-centered, gospel-believing and doctrinally sound culture. Its impact there was that it inspired a progressive era of reforms which was needed coming out of the Civil War, moving forward through the centuries in America, and it influenced future social justice movements. But as you have a lot of these social movements and these reforms, as the church starts moving forward, as it has been and as it always will be, there's always going to be opposition. And while science can be a friend to religion, it also can be one of its biggest obstacles and one of its enemies. And it was during this time that Charles Darwin published his Origin of Species in 1859. Now we have a whole new issue on creation that was being challenged by Charles Darwin, and we had to deal with that as a church here in America. The response was that we had fundamentalism, it rejected evolution. The church kind of knuckled down and said, no, we're not going to take this, we don't believe this, and then said that we're going to reject this theory of evolution. It still was one of the agitators still for another century after that, and it's really only as we look through what science is telling us today that most people are starting to peel away and peel back from holding to a theory of evolution. But at this time, again, this was another turning point. Which way was the church going to go? What was religion going to do when Charles Darwin published his work on evolution? Then we had the Scope the Monkey trial in 1925, where this debated teaching of evolution in schools. You know, we don't have it as much, but this was starting to be introduced, and it was starting to be introduced as fact. And rather than it being a scientific theory, it was introduced into the schools really as this is something that is factual. Its impact, though, we had ongoing debates about science and education. And really, this had the potential to be a really good thing, because when people have honest debate and they are really looking for truth, then the truth will always come to the top. Like cream in milk, it will always rise. So the ongoing debates about science and education did provide a platform for many Christian apologists, especially in the mid to late 20th century. And it also influenced interpretations of many religious texts. But as we moved into the birth of the 20th century, we had an unbelievable revival happening. At the same time, there was a revival happening in Wales, as there was here in the United States of America. And with Topeka, Kansas and Azusa Street, we had these fantastic revivals where the birth of Pentecostalism took root in the early 1900s. It emphasized special gifts, speaking in tongues, but this revival was needed, and it started to spread, and then it started to affect many areas of American culture and society. At the same time, we saw people like Amy Semple McPherson, that was founded at the Foursquare Church, and then also pioneered the use of radio for religious broadcasting. Using radio, using technology for religious broadcasting was something that was new, and that technology was so vital at that moment in time. It allowed for a rapid growth of Pentecostalism and the charismatic movements. It spread by word of mouth, but because it had the radio as an outlet, then it was able to spread that way as well. And it had this expanded reach of religious messages then going throughout the media. But then we had World War One, then we had World War Two. I will say this, that the American church did band together around a common cause concerning World War One and World War Two. And we did see a rise in, especially after World War II, a rise in church membership. We saw a rise in church attendance, construction of new churches and religious institutions were on the rise. And it was post-World War II that for the first time we saw the words "In God We Trust" become the motto in 1956. And then again, under God, one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance in I think 1954. So there were things that were happening. The post-war economic prosperity was something that was coming down the line. But before we got there, we had to kind of tussle and wrestle with a lot of things that were going on. And in this period of time, we had prayer in schools that was taking out Engel versus Vitale. In 1962, they ruled against the official school prayer. We had Roe versus Wade in 1973. And we had the mobilization of pro-life religious activists. Then we had like the moral majority led by Jerry Falwell that came in and founded that in 1979 and sought to influence politics for the first time with conservative Christian values. And here we started to see Christendom and church and pastors and key leaders starting to get involved in politics in ways that they never had done before, whether it was a good thing or whether it was a bad thing, whether it was a messy thing. This is where it really started to influence Christian culture and especially paved the way for a lot of the conservative Christian voters in the 80s, especially through Reagan, and then in the 90s as well, as they looked to place their vote at the ballot when it was time. So they got involved and that started to change the landscape. We just came out of an election season, and the Christian vote is one of the biggest and most sought after votes that any politician is looking for. And it was around this time, post-World War II, coming into the 70s, that we really started to see this take root and then start to grow. We also had increased religious involvement in that political discourse area, and it shaped the conservative political movements of its time. But during this time, as we were coming out of World War II, we also had the evangelical revival. Billy Graham obviously is the most prominent evangelist that we know of, and he emphasized a born-again experience. He held large-scale crusades all around the world, but particularly here in America. And then he was able to ride that wave of political connection as well, and was asked by just about every sitting president to come in and be an advisor to them and to pray with them. The impact of his popularity, the impact of this political popularity, just increased Christianity's evangelical popularization within the US, and it gave more influence as well in these circles. But with influence, with politics, with media, we started to see a new age come through in the 1980s through to the present day. Televangelism, we'd gone from radio, now we've moved into televangelism and started having these personality preachers. And this is not to be too negative on these personality preachers. They are often just a product of what the people are demanding of the time. But they used the television to spread their religious messages, and some of the notable figures were like Pat Robertson, Jim Baker, Joel Osteen. But they had this massive platform now because they were on telly. They'd moved away from just the reach of radio and moved into the television side of things, and this expanded reach of religious programming. They raised concerns about financial practices and accountability, though that was one of the biggest things. That as they were doing it, what they did, people were like, well, hang on, do you need a jet? Do you need all of these extra things? Where is the money going to? So it promoted the gospel, but what gospel was it promoting? And that leads us into, unfortunately, how it started to shape a prosperity gospel, and that started to shape the church and start shaping American culture, which is so affluent in so many places. It's ahead of the world in so many places economically, that people want to be financially sound. And the prosperity gospel in the 80s and 90s was something that was quite prominent. It was a belief that faith and donations led to material wealth. Not a scriptural doctrine, not a true gospel at all. It has elements that you can take from it that are positive, but mainly it ended with many people being in bondage. Some of these key figures were Kenneth Hagin, Creflo Dollar, Oral Roberts. there was obviously massive criticisms of the prosperity gospel, theological concerns everywhere, left, right, and centre. When you opened your Bible and tried to look at what they were preaching, where could you find it? And then obviously the exploitation of its followers. I've unfortunately sat in many a prosperity gospel meeting or crusade in my time, and the exploitation has hit the stomach pretty hard. But what was its impact? Well, influenced perceptions of faith and wealth. It sparked debates within Christian communities of what is the right amount of wealth, how do we actually live out the gospel, if I'm not prospering, have I sinned? It promoted all of these questions. And at the same time, you've got these mega churches from the 80s that were being built, Protestant churches with over 2,000 people in attendance in their weekly services, multiple services, multiple programs, loads of use of technology and media. And it started to become, in some sense, for many places, not every place, but there was a sense of it becoming a marketable show, and moving away from a lot of what a lot of people would be really kind of New Testament koinonia fellowship. But some of the recent trends, though, have moved away from that. You still see a lot of these mega churches, and a lot of them are still done right, but you see a trend moving towards more smaller congregations, moving into a fellowship that they would really want, coffee shops and things like that. These big mega churches, they changed the landscape of America and its Protestantism. They changed how people viewed it. It influenced styles of worship, and it influenced church organization and church governance, which in turn obviously had an impact on the culture around them. And over time, as the attendance started to decline in these places, people, like I said, they started groaning for these smaller community-focused congregations, non-denominational churches, ones with spiritual practices outside of just traditional religion. A lot of people had become disillusioned with the institutional religion. They were looking for authenticity and a desire for personal, meaningful, faithful experiences. That impact of changing the way that they did church, it really did start to change the landscape of America. Well, now a lot of places you'll see that this thirst for authenticity from a congregational member, from their senior leadership, has vastly changed. I think there's been so many people, unfortunately, in leadership that have fallen publicly, that there is a growing sense of a desire for authenticity, and its impact really has increased the diversity of Christian and religious expression. So how can we conclude, as we have looked at how religion has started in the early days with the Pilgrims, the Puritans, the Quakers, and moved throughout history? Religion has been a constant force in shaping American history. Early establishment of faith communities that had evolving interpretations of religious freedom. They moved into early establishment of doctrine through the Great Awakenings. And then we had that establishment of the African American church post the Civil War. Faith challenged the social and political movements of the 19th and 20th centuries and met opposition in the theology of creation, in prayer, in the sanctity of life. All of these things the church had to overcome as it looked to shape the culture of America. The church promoted public evangelism and brought religion front and center through some of its political opportunities. And, of course, unfortunately, the church sometimes erred from sound doctrine and in many cases became a self-help gospel. So it hasn't always been building precept upon precept. It hasn't always been building positively every step of the way. It has had its moments where it's had to recalibrate and look forward to the future. And as we look at the future of the church in America, the church is looking for more authentic leaders. It's looking for tighter, close-knit communities of people that they can do life with together, people that they can lean on together as we look to go back to having koinonia with one another. The church will also need to find that right balance between religious liberty and the doctrines of civil rights as it moves forward, because we see all of these civil rights at our doorstep and the church needs to know, what is it going to do? How is Christianity going to affect good, godly kingdom change with civil rights moving forward? Religion will continue to play a significant role in the American identity and public life. Thank you.